The Boeing 777 hummed through midnight air 39,000 feet above the Pacific, its cabin bathed in the ethereal blue glow of reading lights and phone screens. In Seat 2A, Valentina Vex Kozlova adjusted her silk scarf and closed her laptop, the quarterly earnings report for her defense contracting empire finally complete. The numbers were astronomical: 3.7 billion in revenue, contracts spanning 4 continents, a technological dynasty built from nothing but determination, and an intimate understanding of what militaries truly needed. But tonight, none of that mattered. She was just another passenger on United Flight 847, bound for Tokyo, trying to forget the Senate hearing that had torn apart her reputation 3 days prior. The aircraft shuddered, not the gentle turbulence of normal flight, but something wrong, a violent tremor that sent champagne glasses sliding across first-class tray tables. Emergency oxygen masks deployed with mechanical precision as the cabin pressure alarm pierced the darkness. Through the oval window, Vex watched the port engine's cowling peel away like metallic flower petals, revealing the spinning turbine blades beneath. Hydraulic fluid streaked the wing in silver ribbons. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison." His voice carried the forced calm of a man staring at instrument panels painted in amber warning lights. "We're experiencing a mechanical issue and will be making an emergency descent. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency procedures." What Morrison didn't announce was the radio chatter crackling through his headset. Reports of a massive storm system moving in from the northwest, visibility dropping to 0 at their alternate airports, and worse, complete failure of the backup hydraulic systems. The 777 was bleeding fluid from 3 separate lines, leaving them with manual flight controls only. 293 souls aboard an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to control with each passing minute. Vex had heard that particular strain in a pilot's voice before, during her 8 years flying A-10 Thunderbolts over Afghanistan, when ground fire took out hydraulics, or when bird strikes shattered canopies at 400 knots. She recognized the micro-hesitations, the careful word choices designed to prevent panic while acknowledging reality. This wasn't routine turbulence or a minor system malfunction. This was an aircraft in serious trouble, with weather closing in and limited options shrinking by the minute. She unbuckled her seatbelt despite the illuminated sign and made her way forward, her bare feet silent against the cabin carpet. Years of military bearing couldn't be erased by designer clothes and corporate boardrooms. The businessman in 3B grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat." She looked at his manicured hand, then into his frightened eyes and gently removed his grip. "Not tonight." Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit, his face pale beneath the cabin's emergency lighting. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, searching. When they landed on Vex, something flickered, recognition, perhaps, or desperation. He'd been briefing flight attendants in hushed tones, but now he approached her directly. The weight of what he was about to ask hung between them like suspended gravity. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something that might sound crazy. But first, are you Valentina Kozlova, the pilot who flew combat missions in Afghanistan?" She nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Then I need your help. We've lost all hydraulic assist, manual controls only, and there's a weather system moving into every airport within our fuel range. I've got 293 people aboard, including 67 children, and frankly," his voice cracked slightly, "I don't think I can bring this bird down safely alone." The confession hung in the recycled air. Around them, passengers whispered prayers in 6 different languages, while flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their own fear masked by professional duty. But Vex heard something else in Morrison's words, the recognition of a fellow pilot, someone who understood that some situations demanded more than standard operating procedures. They required the kind of instinctive flight skills forged in combat, where hydraulic failures and damaged aircraft were just Tuesday morning. "What's your experience with manual controls?" she asked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of stressed engines and anxious passengers. Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly. "Flight simulator, mostly. Some emergency training, but never in actual flight conditions like this. The weather's making it worse. We're getting crosswinds that are pushing us around like a toy." He paused, studying her face. "Ma'am, I know this is highly irregular, but your military record shows extensive experience with damaged aircraft recovery. The company lawyers will have my head for even asking, but—" "How long until we reach minimum fuel?" Vex interrupted. 97 minutes, Morrison replied immediately. "And the storm system? 43 minutes out from our primary alternate. It's moving faster than forecast." She looked past him toward the cockpit, where amber warning lights painted the instrument panels in urgent color. Through the small windows, she could see cloud formations building on the horizon, towering cumulonimbus structures that looked like granite monuments in the moonlight. The mathematics of their situation were becoming increasingly unforgiving. "Captain Morrison," she said finally, "I haven't flown anything larger than a business jet in 5 years. But if you're asking whether I can help keep this aircraft controllable until we find a hole in the weather, yes. The principles are the same whether it's an A-10 or a 777. Physics doesn't change." She paused, watching his face. "But I need you to understand something. If I step into that cockpit, I'm not a passenger anymore. I'm not a billionaire CEO. I'm a pilot with a job to do, and I'll do whatever it takes to bring these people home safely." Morrison nodded, relief flooding his features, but Vex wasn't finished. "I also need you to understand that what happens in the next 90 minutes will determine whether 293 people see their families again. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" The question wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Combat had taught her that clear understanding of stakes prevented hesitation when split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. Morrison straightened, his pilot training overriding his fear. "Yes, ma'am, let's bring them home." The cockpit of the 777 was a cathedral of technology, its curved walls lined with digital displays showing system statuses, navigation data, and engine parameters. First Officer Janet Walsh looked up from her emergency checklist as Morrison and Vex entered. Her eyes widened slightly at the unexpected passenger, but she maintained professional composure. "Captain, hydraulic pressure is continuing to drop. We're down to manual trim and rudder authority only. The elevators are responding, but it's taking significant control input to maintain altitude." "Janet, meet Valentina Kozlova. Ms. Kozlova is going to assist us with manual flight control procedures." Walsh's expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and finally acceptance, the kind of rapid mental adjustment pilots learned when situations develop beyond normal parameters. "Ma'am, I've read about your work in Afghanistan. The emergency landing at Bagram with the hydraulic failure." Vex nodded. "Similar situation, different aircraft." "May I see your current control configuration?" The center console showed a maze of switches, levers, and digital readouts. But underlying the 777's sophisticated systems were the same fundamental principles she'd mastered in military aircraft: lift, thrust, drag, and gravity. The hydraulic failure had removed the power assistance that normally made controlling such a massive aircraft manageable. Now it required physical strength, precise technique, and intimate understanding of how air moved over control surfaces. Morrison resumed his position in the left seat, while Vex took the jump seat behind them, studying the instrument layout. "Talk to me about control feel," she said. "How much force are you applying for basic maneuvers?" Morrison's hands were already showing the strain of fighting the manual controls. "It's like wrestling with a giant. Every input requires 10 times the normal pressure. The aircraft wants to roll left due to the asymmetric thrust from the damaged engine." Walsh added, "We're compensating with rudder input, but it's physically exhausting. I don't know how much longer we can maintain precise control." Outside the cockpit windows, the storm system was clearly visible now. a wall of dark clouds stretching from sea level to 40,000 feet, illuminated from within by constant lightning. Weather radar painted it in ominous reds and yellows on their navigation display. The nearest airport with suitable runway length was still 47 minutes away, but the storm would reach them in 31 minutes. Simple mathematics. They would have to fly through severe turbulence while fighting manual controls in an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. "Captain Morrison," came the voice from air traffic control through their headphones, "be advised that Anchorage International is reporting wind gusts to 60 knots with heavy precipitation moving in from the northwest. Visibility is dropping rapidly. Do you have an alternate plan?" Morrison keyed his microphone. "ATC, we're evaluating options. Current fuel state allows for approximately one approach attempt before we reach minimum reserve. Can you provide us with current conditions at any airport south of our position?" The response was immediate and discouraging. "United 847, most airports in your range are reporting deteriorating conditions. The storm system is larger than initially forecast and moving faster than predicted." Vex leaned forward, her voice calm. "Captain, we need to discuss something that might sound unconventional." Morrison turned slightly in his seat. "I'm listening. The storm system has gaps. I can see breaks in the cloud formation at our 10 o'clock position. If we adjust our heading 15 degrees left and maintain current altitude, we might be able to thread between the worst cells. It would mean flying visual reference in some areas, but it could give us cleaner air for the approach." "Visual flight in these conditions?" Walsh questioned. "Ma'am, with respect, regulations require instrument flight rules above 10,000 feet. Vex nodded. "Absolutely correct. But regulations assume normal aircraft control authority. We're operating outside normal parameters now. The question is whether we have better chances fighting severe turbulence with manual controls or finding smoother air that lets us maintain precise aircraft control for the approach." Morrison studied the weather display, weighing options that all carried significant risk. "Ma'am, what's your assessment of our actual capabilities right now?" he asked. Vex moved to where she could see both pilots' control inputs. "Captain, try a 15-degree bank to the left." Morrison applied pressure to the control wheel. The aircraft responded sluggishly, requiring considerable physical effort to achieve and maintain the bank angle. When he returned to level flight, his breathing had increased noticeably. "Honestly, you're both fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. In 30 minutes, when fatigue sets in and we hit turbulence, those control inputs are going to become inconsistent. That's when we lose the aircraft." She paused, letting that sink in. "But there's another way. In the A-10, we learned to work with compromised systems instead of against them. This aircraft wants to roll left, let it. Use that tendency. Instead of fighting every input, we anticipate the aircraft's behavior and use its natural responses to our advantage. It's like riding a horse that has its own opinions. You don't fight the horse, you guide it where you want to go." Morrison looked skeptical. "Ma'am, we're talking about a 700,000-pound aircraft with 293 people aboard. This isn't a single-seat fighter." "No," Vex replied, "it's not. It's heavier, which means it has more inertia. Once we establish a stable flight attitude, momentum works in our favor. The key is making smooth, deliberate control inputs and letting the aircraft settle between adjustments. Fighting it creates oscillations that require constant correction. Working with it creates stable flight." The radio crackled again. "United 847, this is Seattle Center. We're tracking your position and have noticed your heading deviation. Are you declaring an emergency?" Morrison looked at Vex, who nodded slightly. "Seattle Center, United 847 declaring an emergency. We have complete hydraulic failure, manual controls only, with 293 souls on board. Requesting priority handling and weather updates for all airports within our fuel range." The controller's voice became noticeably more focused. "United 847, emergency services are being alerted. Current weather shows improving conditions at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage. Would military runway be acceptable for your aircraft type? Elmendorf, Vex murmured, a slight smile crossing her face. Captain, that's actually perfect for us. Military runways are longer and wider than civilian airports. More room for error if our approach isn't perfect. Morrison keyed his microphone. Seattle Center, affirmative on Elmendorf. Will need emergency equipment standing by and all available runway lighting. Also requesting current wind conditions and any special approach procedures for aircraft with limited control authority. Through the cockpit windows, the lights of the Alaskan coast were becoming visible, scattered points of illumination against the dark landscape. But between them and those lights lay 37 minutes of flight time through increasingly challenging conditions. The storm system continued its relentless advance, and their fuel gauges showed the steady countdown to minimum reserves. Each passing minute reduced their options and increased the complexity of their situation. Walsh spoke up from the right seat. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Vex nodded. "During your military service, did you ever have a situation this complex? Multiple system failures, whether fuel constraints all at once?" Vex considered the question carefully. "Once. Over Afghanistan in 2018. Bird strike took out most of our flight controls about 40 minutes from base. Weather was moving in, fuel was tight, and I was flying with a new wingman who'd never dealt with emergency procedures in combat conditions." She paused. "But here's the thing about emergency situations. They're only as complicated as you allow them to become." "What do you mean?" Morrison asked, his attention divided between the conversation and the constant pressure required to maintain their heading. "Every emergency has layers of problems," Vex explained. "But beneath all those layers are basic principles. Keep the aircraft flying, maintain directional control, find a suitable place to land. Everything else, whether fuel, mechanical failures, passenger concerns, those are just variables in the equation. The equation itself remains the same." She moved closer to the center console, studying their current flight configuration. "Right now, your primary challenge isn't the hydraulic failure or the weather or the fuel situation. It's fatigue. You're both working too hard to maintain aircraft control. In 20 minutes, your arms will be shaking. In 30 minutes, you'll start making errors in judgment because you're focused on fighting the controls instead of flying the aircraft." "So what's the solution?" Walsh asked. Vex looked at both pilots, then at the instrument panel showing their current flight status. "We're going to fundamentally change how you're flying this aircraft. Instead of fighting its tendencies, we're going to use them. Instead of making constant small corrections, we're going to make larger, deliberate adjustments and let the aircraft stabilize between inputs. It's going to feel wrong at first because it goes against everything you learned in flight training. But it works." Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cockpit's controlled temperature. "Ma'am, I appreciate your confidence, but we're responsible for nearly 300 lives. I can't experiment with unconventional flying techniques." Vex met his eyes directly. "Captain, I'm not asking you to experiment. I'm asking you to trust techniques that have been proven in combat conditions. The physics are identical whether it's an A-10 or a 777. The principles that kept me alive over Afghanistan will work here too." She paused, her voice becoming softer. "But I understand your position. You have a responsibility to these passengers that goes beyond just flying the aircraft safely. You have to answer to investigators, lawyers, company officials, families. I get that. In combat, the only thing that mattered was bringing the aircraft home. Here, you have to consider how your decisions will be evaluated by people who weren't in this cockpit tonight." Morrison nodded, appreciating her understanding of his broader responsibilities. "However," Vex continued, "in 18 minutes, none of those considerations will matter if we can't maintain aircraft control through the turbulence ahead. The storm system is going to test every aspect of our flying skills. We can either prepare for that challenge now, or we can continue current techniques and hope for the best." Walsh looked at the weather radar showing increasing intensity ahead. "Ma'am, what exactly are you proposing?" a systematic approach to manual flight control that reduces pilot workload and increases aircraft stability, Vex replied. Starting with trim configuration. She pointed to the trim controls. Right now you're using elevator trim to maintain level flight, which is standard procedure. But with manual controls, we want to set the trim slightly nose heavy and use deliberate back pressure on the yoke to maintain altitude. It sounds counterintuitive, but it gives you more precise control over vertical movement. Morrison looked uncertain. That goes against everything I learned about trim usage. In normal flight, yes, Vex agreed. But these aren't normal conditions. With manual controls, slight nose-heavy trim gives you a reference point. You feel the aircraft's tendency to descend, and you apply just enough back pressure to maintain altitude. When turbulence hits, instead of fighting to maintain exact altitude, you focus on preventing excessive altitude loss. The trim helps you feel what the aircraft wants to do. Walsh was studying the concept. It's like having a constant reminder of the aircraft's attitude. Exactly, Vex confirmed. And it reduces the mental workload. Instead of constantly monitoring altitude and making corrections, you feel the aircraft's tendency and respond accordingly. Your hands and arms aren't fighting the controls, they're guiding the aircraft. She looked at both pilots. Are you willing to try it? Morrison glanced at their fuel gauges, then at the approaching storm system. The mathematics of their situation were becoming increasingly stark. Let's do it, he decided, but carefully and with your guidance. Vex nodded and moved to where she could clearly see both the flight controls and the instrument displays. First, let's adjust the elevator trim 2 units nose heavy. Captain Morrison, when you feel the aircraft want to descend, apply gentle back pressure. Not enough to climb, just enough to arrest the descent. The change was subtle but immediate. Morrison's constant fight with the controls eased slightly. I can feel the difference, he reported. The aircraft feels more stable, even with the asymmetric thrust from the damaged engine. Walsh monitored their altitude and heading. Maintaining altitude within 50 feet, which is actually better than we were doing with normal trim settings. The technique was working, but this was only the beginning of preparing for what lay ahead. Now for lateral control, Vex continued. The aircraft wants to roll left due to the asymmetric thrust. Instead of constantly fighting that tendency, we're going to use deliberate aileron inputs to maintain wings-level flight. Captain Morrison, let the aircraft roll about 5 degrees left, then apply right aileron pressure to bring it back to level. Don't fight the roll, guide it back to where you want it. Morrison tried the technique, allowing the aircraft to develop a slight left bank before applying correction. The control input felt more natural, requiring less physical force to achieve the desired result. It's like steering a ship instead of wrestling with it, he observed. The aircraft responds more predictably to larger, more deliberate inputs. Walsh added, and it's less fatiguing. I can see how this would be sustainable for extended periods. Through the windscreen, the storm clouds were clearly visible now, their internal lightning creating a constant light show against the darkness. Weather radar showed areas of severe turbulence directly ahead, but also gaps between the worst cells where they might find smoother air. The decision about their routing through the storm system would need to be made soon. Seattle Center, United 847, Morrison called on the radio. We're approaching the weather system and request guidance on routing to minimize turbulence. We have limited control authority and would like to avoid the worst areas if possible. The controller's response was immediate. United 847, radar shows possible gaps at your 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock positions. The 10 o'clock routing would add approximately 8 minutes to your flight time, but appears to have less severe weather. Can you accept the additional flight time? Morrison looked at their fuel gauges. 8 minutes would bring them very close to minimum reserves, but avoiding severe turbulence might be worth the risk. Ma'am, he asked Vex, what's your assessment? She studied the weather display, comparing the radar returns with what she could see through the windscreen. The 10 o'clock route looks cleaner, and 8 minutes isn't critical if it means we maintain better aircraft control through the weather. I recommend we take it. Seattle Center, United 847 accepting the 10 o'clock routing, requesting vectors around the worst weather. The controller began providing heading changes that would thread them between the most severe storm cells. As they turned toward their new routing, the first wisps of cloud began streaming past their windows. They were entering the outer edges of the weather system, and the next 20 minutes would test every aspect of their emergency procedures. The first turbulence hit like an invisible fist, jolting the aircraft sharply upward before dropping it into a pocket of thin air. But Morrison's response was different now. Instead of fighting the aircraft's movement with constant control inputs, he allowed it to move within acceptable limits and made deliberate corrections to maintain their overall flight path. The technique was working, but the real test lay ahead in the heart of the storm system. "All passengers, this is the captain," Morrison announced over the cabin intercom. "We're entering some rough weather, but we're making good progress toward our destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and remain seated until we're through this area. Flight attendants, please secure yourselves for the next 15 minutes. His voice carried more confidence now, the result of having viable techniques for managing their emergency situation. Vex monitored both pilots' performance as they entered deeper into the weather system. The manual control techniques were proving effective, but the physical demands were still significant. "How are you feeling, Captain Morrison? Any fatigue in your arms or shoulders?" He flexed his hands on the control yoke. "Better than before. The control inputs feel more natural now, less like I'm fighting the aircraft." Walsh added, "I'm monitoring engine parameters and navigation. Everything looks stable." But stability was relative. Through the storm clouds, lightning illuminated the aircraft in strobing white light, and turbulence increased in intensity. Each air pocket and wind shear required careful control inputs to maintain their flight path. The techniques Vex had taught them were working, but the weather was testing those techniques to their limits. In the passenger cabin behind them, 293 people were depending on their ability to navigate through conditions that challenged even experienced pilots. The radio crackled with updates from air traffic control. United 847, Elmendorf Air Force Base is reporting winds 270 at 25 knots, gusting to 35. Runway 24 is available with full emergency equipment standing by. Current visibility is 7 miles and decreasing. How do you estimate your arrival time? Morrison calculated quickly based on their current ground speed and distance remaining. Seattle Center, United 847 estimates Elmendorf in 23 minutes. Understood, United 847. Emergency equipment is in position and the field is cleared for your approach. Be advised that weather conditions are expected to deteriorate further in the next 30 minutes, so you're arriving within an acceptable window. The controller's words carried subtle urgency. They were racing against both fuel consumption and deteriorating weather conditions. Everything had to work perfectly for the next 23 minutes. As they continued through the storm system, Vex began thinking ahead to their approach and landing procedures. "Captain Morrison, we need to discuss approach configuration and landing techniques for manual control flight." Morrison nodded while maintaining his concentration on flying through the turbulence. "What are your recommendations?" Vex considered the unique challenges they would face during their approach to Elmendorf. "First, we'll configure for landing much earlier than normal. Deploying flaps and landing gear in smooth air is much easier than trying to reconfigure during the approach. Second, we'll plan for a slightly higher approach speed to maintain better control authority. And third, we'll use a technique called flying the aircraft to the ground instead of the normal flare and touchdown sequence." Morrison looked puzzled. "Can you explain that technique?" "Instead of reducing power and flaring for a soft touchdown, we'll maintain approach power and attitude all the way to ground contact. It sounds rough, but it gives us much better control during the final moments of flight when precision is critical. The landing will be firm, but the aircraft can handle it, and it reduces the chance of losing control during the most critical phase. Walsh looked concerned. That's significantly different from standard procedures. Vex nodded. It is, but standard procedures assume normal control authority. We're operating outside those parameters now. She paused, looking at both pilots. However, this is entirely your decision. I'm providing information based on emergency techniques used in military aviation. The final choices about how to approach and land this aircraft rest with you as the captain and first officer. Morrison weighed the options while continuing to fly through increasingly challenging weather conditions. His training emphasized following established procedures, but his experience told him that established procedures might not be adequate for their current situation. Ma'am, in your military experience, how often did these emergency techniques result in successful outcomes? Vex met his eyes directly. When applied correctly, in appropriate situations, by properly trained pilots, very high success rate. But I won't lie to you. They require precise execution and can't tolerate errors. The decision carried enormous weight. Morrison was responsible not just for the aircraft and its passengers, but for choices that would be scrutinized by investigators, lawyers, and industry experts. Using unconventional techniques could save lives or result in criticism if anything went wrong. But continuing with standard procedures in non-standard conditions carried its own risks. As commander of the aircraft, he had to choose the approach most likely to bring everyone home safely. We'll follow your recommendations, he decided, but I need you to guide us through each step of the process. Vex accepted the responsibility. Understood, Captain. I'll provide detailed guidance for every phase of the approach and landing. First, let's begin early configuration for landing. We're currently 21 minutes from Elmendorf, which gives us time to configure the aircraft systematically and verify that all systems respond properly with manual controls. They began the process of preparing for landing while still navigating through the storm system. Each step, extending flaps, lowering landing gear, adjusting trim settings, required careful coordination and verification that the aircraft responded as expected. With manual controls, even routine configuration changes became complex procedures requiring focused attention and precise technique. Walsh monitored engine parameters and fuel consumption as they worked through their pre-landing checklist. Fuel remaining shows 37 minutes at current consumption rate, she reported. That's cutting it close, but manageable if everything goes smoothly during the approach. Morrison acknowledged while maintaining their course through the final section of the storm system. Ahead of them, the clouds were beginning to thin, revealing patches of clear air and the lights of Anchorage in the distance. There, Vex pointed through the windscreen toward a gap in the clouds. That's our exit from the weather system. Once we're through that opening, we'll have clear air for the approach to Elmendorf. The aircraft broke through the final layer of storm clouds into smooth air filled with stars and the distant glow of the airport. After 38 minutes of fighting turbulence with manual controls, the sudden calm felt almost surreal. Elmendorf Approach Control, United 847 with you, declaring emergency manual controls only, requesting vectors for straighten approach to runway 24. The military controller's voice was crisp and professional. United 847, Elmendorf Approach, radar contact 12 miles northwest of the field. Emergency equipment is standing by. Fly heading 140, descend and maintain 3,000 feet. Report aircraft configuration and souls on board. Morrison keyed his microphone. United 847, heading 140, descending to 3,000. Aircraft configured for landing, manual controls due to complete hydraulic failure. 293 souls on board, fuel for approximately one approach attempt. The controller acknowledged and began vectoring them toward the final approach course. This was the critical phase where everything they had learned about manual flight control would be tested. Captain Morrison, Vex said quietly, you've done an exceptional job managing this emergency. The next 12 minutes will require the same steady technique you've been using, just with more precision during the final approach. Trust your instincts and the control techniques we've practiced. The aircraft will respond predictably if we maintain consistent inputs." Morrison nodded, his concentration focused on the approach ahead. Walsh called out their altitude and configuration as they descended toward the airport. Passing 4,000 feet, landing gear down and locked, flaps at landing position, approach speed looking good. Through the windscreen, the runway lights of Elmendorf Air Force Base stretched ahead of them like a constellation against the Alaskan landscape. Emergency vehicles were visible along the runway, their red and blue lights creating urgent patterns in the darkness. United 847, you're cleared for straighten approach runway 24. Wind 270 at 22 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by. Morrison acknowledged the clearance and began the final approach, using the manual control techniques they had developed during their emergency. The aircraft responded smoothly to his inputs, maintaining a stable descent path toward the runway threshold. But as they descended through 1,000 feet, a new challenge emerged. Crosswinds at the surface were stronger than reported, pushing the aircraft sideways relative to the runway centerline. With manual controls, correcting for wind drift required constant attention and precise rudder inputs to maintain their approach path. Morrison fought to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway, while Vex provided guidance on control techniques for crosswind landings with limited control authority. "Slight right rudder to counter the wind drift," she coached. "Don't over-control, let the aircraft settle between inputs." Morrison applied the correction, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly to his rudder input. The runway was growing larger in their windscreen, but they were still drifting left of centerline despite his corrections. Walsh called out their altitude. 500 feet, approach speed stable, slight left drift from runway centerline. At 400 feet, Morrison made the decision to execute the landing technique Vex had recommended. Instead of reducing power for a normal flare and touchdown, he maintained approach power and attitude, flying the aircraft toward the runway surface. The technique felt wrong to his trained instincts, but it gave him positive control of the aircraft's flight path during the most critical moments of the approach. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a firm impact that resonated through the aircraft structure. Morrison maintained back pressure on the control yoke while gradually reducing power, keeping the aircraft tracking straight down the runway centerline. The nose gear settled onto the runway with another solid impact, and immediately he applied maximum braking while using rudder inputs to maintain directional control. "United 847 is on the ground, runway 24, he announced to Elmendorf approach control. The controller's response carried obvious relief. "United 847, taxi clear of the runway when able. Outstanding job bringing that aircraft down safely." Emergency vehicles followed them as they cleared the active runway and taxied toward the military ramp, their mission finally complete after 1 hour and 47 minutes of emergency flight operations. As the aircraft came to a complete stop and Morrison shut down the engines, the cockpit fell silent except for the cooling sounds of metal contracting and systems powering down. Walsh completed the post-flight checklist while Vex sat quietly in the jump seat, watching the emergency personnel surrounding their aircraft. 293 passengers and crew members were safe on the ground, but the magnitude of what they had accomplished was only beginning to sink in. Morrison turned to face her. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for what you did tonight. Without your knowledge of manual flight control techniques, I honestly don't think we would have made it." Vex shook her head slightly. "Captain, you and First Officer Walsh flew this aircraft through an impossible situation. I just provided some techniques based on military experience. The skill and decision-making that brought everyone home safely, that was all you." But even as she spoke those words, Vex knew that something fundamental had changed during their flight through the storm. For 8 years after leaving military service, she had built a corporate empire based on understanding what pilots needed from their equipment. Tonight, she had rediscovered what it meant to be a pilot herself, not the board meetings and profit margins and Senate hearings, but the pure essence of aviation, keeping people safe through knowledge, skill, and absolute commitment to the mission. Outside the cockpit windows, passengers were beginning to disembark through emergency slides deployed by ground personnel. Families would be reunited, business trips would be delayed but not canceled, and lives would continue because of decisions made and actions taken during 97 minutes above the Pacific Ocean. The mathematics of their emergency had been unforgiving, but human skill and determination had proven greater than mechanical failure and adverse weather. As emergency personnel helped passengers evacuate the aircraft, news crews were already arriving at Elmendorf Air Force Base. Within hours, the story would spread across social media and news networks. The billionaire defense contractor who helped save nearly 300 lives on a crippled airliner. But that narrative would miss the deeper truth of what had happened in the cockpit that night. Three pilots working together to solve a complex problem using skills developed in very different environments. Walsh secured the cockpit systems and gathered her flight materials. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Vex nodded. "Tonight, when you were teaching us those manual control techniques, it was like watching someone remember something they'd forgotten. You seemed different from the corporate executive who boarded in Seattle." Vex considered the observation carefully. Maybe because for the first time in 5 years, I was doing what I was trained to do instead of talking about it in boardrooms. Morrison overheard the conversation. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what made you leave military aviation for the corporate world?" It was a question Vex had been asked many times by reporters and industry analysts, and her standard answer focused on business opportunities and market timing. But tonight, in the quiet cockpit of an aircraft they had just landed safely, the real answer seemed more appropriate. "I thought I could make a bigger difference by building the equipment pilots needed instead of flying it myself," she said slowly. "And maybe I was right. My company has built systems that have saved countless lives. But tonight reminded me that there's something irreplaceable about actually being in the cockpit when everything goes wrong. All the corporate success in the world doesn't compare to the feeling of bringing people home safely." The three of them sat in the cockpit for several more minutes, processing what they had experienced together. Outside, ground crews were beginning the process of inspecting the aircraft and documenting the hydraulic failures that had created their emergency. Investigators would spend weeks analyzing every decision and procedure, but the human elements, courage, skill, teamwork, would be harder to quantify in their reports. Finally, Morrison broke the silence. "Ma'am, I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate, but would you consider returning to aviation? Not necessarily military flying, but perhaps training or emergency procedures development. Tonight prove